We now embark on the third phase of this course, related to intuition in the thought and praxis of Sri Aurobindo. To introduce this phase, let me start with a few words on Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo was born Aurobindo Ghosh in 1872 in Calcutta, India, under British colonial occupation. His father was a doctor, a Bengali that belonged to a class of native elite that acculturated themselves for professional dealings with both the British and Indians, and thereby began developing a culture of hybridity, of critical, reformist and revolutionary thought. Aurobindo's father was an Anglophile, critical towards pre-modern India, and sent 3 of his 4 sons to study in England. Aurobindo schooled at St. Paul's School in London and followed this with a tripos in the classics from Cambridge University. He completed these studies and left England for India in 1893. In school and at Cambridge, he was at the top of his class in Greek and Latin, which meant he had a deep grounding in classical philosophy, especially Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. He was also well versed in French, Italian, and German, and read continental literature of his time selectively. He read the German transcendentalists, though he was more inclined towards literature than philosophy. He was deeply appreciative of Goethe and the English Romantic poets, who could be said to have put to literary practice the ideas of the German transcendentalists. Undoubtedly, he was exposed to Kant and Hegel at Cambridge and came to have browsed their works, but not felt interested enough to pursue them. Undoubtedly, he was exposed to Darwin. As one may see from his dates, Nietzsche and Bergson were both active during his years in Cambridge. He read Nietzsche, who I believe was influential to his thinking, and the presence of whose works may be seen in several places in his own works. He also read Bergson, though it is not known definitively whether this was while he was at Cambridge or after he returned to India. As we'll see, there are signs of his reading of Bergson in his commentary on the Kena Upanishad. After his return to India, 3 new lines of development that were connected opened up for him. Number 1, he delved deep into Sanskrit texts, principally the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Rig Veda, and classical Sanskrit literature such as the Mahabharata and the works of Kalidasa that had been so influential to Goethe and several of the German transcendentalists. Number 2, he played a prominent part in the early movement for national liberation in India, both cultural and political. And number 3, he encountered experiences of a supraphysical nature that drove him to the study and practice of yoga. Certain consequences germane to our study followed from these activities. From 1900, he began translating and commenting on the Upanishads. His earliest translation of the Kena Upanishad coming from that year. In January 1908, he worked with a yogi and had a significant spiritual experience which he characterized as nirvana. And in May of that year, he was incarcerated for a year, facing trial on the charge of conspiracy against the British Crown. This year proved to be an immensely fertile period for the exploration of psychic and spiritual possibilities and could be considered definitive in the development of his philosophical and practical systems. He was released from prison in 1909, and in 1910, evading the threat of deportation, he moved successively to the French colonies of Chandanagar and Pondicherry, where he devoted himself to his yogic activities, surrounded by a handful of revolutionary and spiritual followers. In 1914, he was visited by a French couple, prominent in countercultural esoteric circles in Paris, Paul Richard and Mira Alfassa, and found remarkable consonance of thought with them. At their urging, he joined them in the publication of a monthly philosophical review titled Arya that was to be produced bilingually in English and French. Shortly after the start of World War I, the Richards returned to France and went thence to Japan, and Sri Aurobindo was left to continue the journal by himself. The journal, published till 1920, is where he serialized his principal works, which were published separately in his collected works in 1972 and later in his complete works. These works included his major work of philosophy, The Life Divine, a volume on his system of yoga, The Synthesis of Yoga, his commentaries on Sanskrit philosophical texts such as the Veda, the Upanishads, and the Gita, and his works of literature and cultural criticism. The translation and commentary of the Kena Upanishad was serialized here between 1915 and 1916. Sri Aurobindo also serialized an extensive commentary on the Isha Upanishad, which includes some of the core ideas of his own philosophical system. In completing this biographical review, it needs to be added that the Richards returned to Pondicherry after the war in 1920, and that Mira remained to work with Sri Aurobindo as his Shakti and spiritual collaborator. She contributed significantly to the finalized version of his yoga, such that Sri Aurobindo was explicit that the yoga system taught by them were their joint creation. Around 1926, Sri Aurobindo designated her as the mother and put her in charge of the spiritual and material organization of their followers in an ashram, that is, hermitage, created for the practice of their yoga. To segue from our studies of intuition in Bergson and Deleuze to Sri Aurobindo, I would like to reiterate some comparable and overlapping themes. The first of these is the overturning of a philosophy of transcendence. In Deleuze, this takes the form of an inversion of Platonism, by which is meant Plato's model of the relation between the ideal and the empirical as developed in texts such as the Phaedo, Phaedrus, and the Republic. Plato divides reality into two zones, the ideal and the empirical or sensible. In earthly experience, we find ourselves in the realm of the sensible. The realm of the sensible shows us a multiplicity of changing forms. The ideal world, on the other hand, carries the aspatial and atemporal blueprints of ideal forms or ideas, while the sensible world carries changing semblances of these forms in substance. The ideal world is thus transcendent to the sensible world, and the forms of the ideal world are the originals, of which the forms of the sensible world are copies. In Aristotle, this relation between ideal and sensible forms becomes the basis of what he called hylomorphism, or the imprinting or molding of substance by form to make copies. The experience of the sensible realm does not offer us a datum of truth, because its forms are inaccurate and changing copies of the ideal forms, according to Plato. Whereas rational exercise can help to clarify some of the confusions and illusions of sensible experience towards the recognition of the ideas, it is only a direct knowledge of the ideal that can bring clarity of understanding. According to Plato, who believed in the transmigration of souls, all humans have been reborn on earth after a fall from the ideal world. Hence, all humans have a remembrance of ideal forms in their psychic memory. Plato recommends a process of remembrance or anamnesis to contact the memory of the ideal forms so as to recognize and represent them in the sensible realm. Thus, the sensible realm is irreducibly different from the ideal realm, which is only accessible to us through a faint memory of the transcendent domain. Enlightenment thought, which had no place for transmigration, did away with the theory of anamnesis, but retained the dualism of transcendent and sensible realms, subordinating the latter to the first through the seeking for invariant laws to explain and control the sensible world. Kant, one of the Enlightenment thinkers, brought back a quasi-Platonic notion of ideas, but these do not belong to a separate ideal transcendence. Rather, they become regulative, transcendent ideas of reason. Now, why should we be worried about such forms of transcendence? We have often heard the idiom, "the map is not the territory." But what is not so often heard and remains implicit is that the map is a device to represent a territory. In fact, to colonize it. Our transcendent schemas remain outside our sensible ones, even when they claim to be inside them. They exile, subordinate, or distort its excess to its own designs and become the ontological basis of their control. Kant's transcendental idealism marks a transition point from the rational empiricism of foregoing Enlightenment thought to the modern attempt to overcome all exclusionary philosophies of transcendence. It is to be noted that here the word transcendental for Kant referred to conditions that were not empirically sensible but immanent to the mind, which made empirical experience possible. Kant's transcendental idealism claims empirical experience to be conditioned by transcendental categories and regulated by transcendent ideas, so that the thing in itself, as he called it, remains unknowable to us. While these thinkers constitute the major lineage of Western philosophy, Deleuze resurrects an alternate minor lineage that eschews a transcendent foundation of reality in favor of an immanent one. This lineage includes thinkers like Duns Scotus, Spinoza, Salomon Maimon, Nietzsche, and Bergson. Immanence means that instead of a sensible world of approximate copies of transcendent originals, we have the infinite self-becomings of the One. Instead of predictable changes subject to laws, we have degrees of creative freedom and participation. As we have seen, Bergson challenged the transcendent unknowability of the thing in itself in the name of intuition in a philosophy of becoming. Bergson's world is an interrelated ontology of duration, made up of participation, leading to creative evolution. With Deleuze, we have a furtherance of Bergson's ontology, synthesized with Spinoza's univocal expressionism and Nietzsche's eternal return. Ideas in Deleuze, following Maimon, are dynamic differential relations that form a problematic field which is reciprocally determined in actualizations. As mentioned, Kant called his philosophy transcendental idealism because he sought the transcendental conditions for the ideal synthesis of possible experience. In turn, Deleuze called his philosophy transcendental empiricism because he sought the transcendental conditions for the genesis of real or empirical experience. Deleuze's relation with Kant with respect to their respective projects occurs most relevantly in his consideration of Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment. Here, while discussing the experience of the sublime, Kant refers to a disjunction between the faculties of imagination and reason. They become unhinged, as it were, and lose the easy assumption of common sense. The imagination experiences a failure to grasp something too great or powerful and engenders a negative emotion. The reason, on the other hand, drawing on the transcendent idea of the infinite, enters into an accord with the imagination, pushing it to its limit to modify its fear or revulsion to a state of awe and pleasure. Deleuze uses this consideration to push further with the disjunction of the faculties, finding the transcendental conditions of genesis in the real idea, immanent both in sensible nature and in the faculty of the transcendental exercise. As he puts it in chapter 1 of Difference and Repetition, quote, empiricism truly becomes transcendental and aesthetics an apodictic discipline only when we apprehend directly in the sensible that which can only be sensed, the very being of the sensible. It is in difference that movement is produced as an effect, that phenomena flash their meanings like signs. Unquote. He further elaborates on the independent transcendent exercise of all the faculties, each of which overpasses its finite limit in the encounter and apprehends the being of the idea in its own function. The internal communication of their excess is what constitutes then the free accord of the faculties. Unhinged from the centralizing cogito, their unity only ensured by mutual communication of the violent charge of the dark precursor or the idea. As he says in chapter 3, quote, each faculty must be borne to the extreme point of its dissolution, at which it falls prey to a triple violence. The violence of that which forces it to be exercised, of that which it is forced to grasp, and which it alone is able to grasp, yet also that of the ungraspable from the point of view of its empirical exercise. We ask, for example, what forces sensibility to sense? What is it that can only be sensed, yet is imperceptible at the same time? We must pose this question not only for memory and thought, but also for the imagination, is there an imaginandum, a fantastion, which would only be the limit, that which is impossible to imagine? For language, is there a loquendum, that which would be silence at the same time? And for the other faculties, which would find their place in a complete doctrine, vitality, the transcendent object of which would include monstrosity, and sociability, the transcendent object of which would include anarchy, and even for faculties yet to be discovered, whose existence is not even suspected." Unquote. Deleuze's engagement with the history of transcendent philosophy for its overturning follows in the wake of Heidegger's historiography, undertaken for the destruction of metaphysics. For his purpose, Heidegger goes back to the early Greek sources, including pre-Socratic philosophers and Plato. Sri Aurobindo's revisionary engagements with early Sanskrit texts serve a similar purpose. As we have seen, Sri Aurobindo was very familiar with early Greek philosophy and wrote a short monograph on the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. Like the history of philosophy in the West, the major traditions of Indian philosophy had privileged transcendent interpretations of the Upanishads. Here, it is not so much a case of mind over matter or ideal and sensible forms. It is rather a negative theology leading to an exclusive transcendent, denying the sensible world as illusory. Alternatively, there were theistic interpretations, which privileged relations between the divine in suprasensible ideal worlds. Sri Aurobindo wrote commentaries on the Isha and Kena Upanishads, because these were two of the Upanishads which were most explicitly immanent. His commentaries on these Upanishads emphasize their immanent properties as central to their intent, while critiquing exclusive transcendent interpretations. Like all Upanishads, these are texts of contemplative philosophy, which serve the object of experience and transformation. The Kena Upanishad is made up of 4 chapters. The term Kena means by whom or what. It is the instrumental case of the noun ka, meaning who or what. It is interesting to note that in Sanskrit there is a single word for both subject and object, pointing to their intuitive connection and underlying identity. The very first chapter introduces the contemplative questions of the Upanishad. They have to do with the agent or agents that instrumentalize the faculties, which are given as mind, life breath or prana, speech, eye, and ear, that is the senses. It is important to note also that the questioning revolves around the will. What is the center of coherence and power of execution of the faculties of reception and expression of the mind? It is quickly apparent that the center of coherence is not the common sense or cogito, and the power of expression is also not the cogito. We are immediately pushed to conceive of independent faculties which are the origin of our faculties, each of which is inconceivable and unreachable by the faculty. Quote, "It is other than the known, it is there above the unknown." Unquote. Yet, which is the source of the function of the faculty and works as and through the faculty. From the 4th to the 8th verse of the first chapter, we are told that the origin of each of the faculties is Brahman. Brahman is a term which comes to prominence in the Upanishads and means the absolute. But as Sri Aurobindo points out, in identifying it explicitly in terms of the faculties, its immanence in the subject and world, the who and the what, is being highlighted with an aim to direct its intuition by each of the faculties. Brahman is, in this sense, is synonymous with the plane of immanence. It is immanent to everything. There is nothing outside it. It is also absolutely undetermined, yet self-determined in time. It is also absolutely one and radically plural. Answering to Deleuze and Guattari's description of the plane of immanence as pluralism is equal to monism. The second chapter introduces the Brahman as a problem of knowledge. It is unknowable by the mind, yet it is the true knower immanent in the mind, the deepest unthought within the thought. Verse 4 refers to a reflexive perception by which it can be known. It implies the receptivity of the faculties by themselves and in their root. The mind to their source. We see the goal of this knowledge given here as immortality, amritam, and the force, viryam, to attain to it is that of the self, Atman. If each of the faculties intuits and attains to its own superior function in the Brahman, yet is the whole lifted to a state of immortality by the power of the self, Atman. Here we seem to find a difference with Deleuze. For Deleuze, there is a dissolution of the self and no center to the faculties in their superior exercise. In his case, following Kant, in its normal operation, the self-identity is split into an I which encounters empirical experiences in time and a self which is a cogito that ensures the stability of the world in recognition and representation. With the unhinging of the cogito, the faculties are freed to relate to their ontological sources, while the I is fractured and the self is dissolved. Deleuze refers to this as, quote, the fractured I and the system of the dissolved self, unquote. The dark precursor or real idea of the faculties and the univocity of the plane of immanence to which it belongs ensures directly the operation of the part objects in relation to an aleatory point. The idea is not an object, but a relational differential that is reciprocally determined in spatio-temporal becomings. An aleatory point implies a dice throw, which can only occur in time. At the same time, it should be noted that the idea as differential relation has duration. At one point in chapter 3, Deleuze refers to it as the logos. Quote, each faculty, including thought, has only involuntary adventures. The logos breaks up into hieroglyphics, each one of which speaks the transcendent language of a faculty, unquote. This logos is clearly not the static and exclusive logos of a transcendent outside time, the logocentric center of the dogmatic or doxic image of thought. It is a paradoxical logos, the being of the becoming. This logos, which erases the distinction between the transcendent and immanent, is the mind of the mind, or supermind in the words of Sri Aurobindo, that the Upanishad refers to. Immortality is its property, not because it is eternal outside time, but because it is the being of the eternal return. As for the self or Atman, it is neither the empirical I nor the cogito, but a paradoxical center of individuation of the plane of immanence. It is that which reincarnates perpetually, the being of the return in the individual. I have spoken elsewhere about the historical conditions for the conceptual development of Brahman and Atman as terms in the Upanishads as deriving from a closed society of hierarchic social norms in which there was no space for critical distance or unmediated relation with the infinite. Thus, in the Upanishad, the dissolution of the constituted self through the disjunction of the faculties and their direct identification with the transcendental being of the function that is their source paves the way for a new constitution of the self around the Brahman in its status as mind of the mind or supermind, the being of the becoming, immortal because the being of the eternal return. But what ensures this for the individual is the discovery of the being of the return in the individual and its aspiration to identity with its source as the supermind. The remaining verses in the chapter highlight the immanent realization of this transformed status of the self by emphasizing the need to come to this knowledge here, on earth in this life. The third chapter introduces us to a parable which stages an encounter between three gods and the Brahman, here referred to as a daemon, yaksha in Sanskrit. Sri Aurobindo uses the term daemon. Sri Aurobindo relates the first verse on the growth to greatness of the gods in the victory of the Brahman in terms of the hubris or peak points of civilization, as in our times. The gods refer to the cosmic powers of order represented in us as the human activity of the faculties. It is at such peak points of human achievement that the gods exult in their victory and invite the encounter of Brahman. We are reminded of Deleuze's characterization of the encounter in chapter 3. Quote, "It is not the gods which we encounter. Even hidden, the gods are only the forms of recognition. What we encounter are the demons, the sign bearers, powers of the leap, the interval, the intensive and the instant, powers which only cover difference with more difference." Unquote. In the symbolic encounter, each of the gods, Indra, Vayu and Agni, is tested in its functioning by Brahman and fails. Though the Upanishad begins with 5 faculties, seeing, hearing, mind, speech and breath, each of which finds its own version of the idea through which Brahman determines itself and functions in it, here we find a reduction of their operations in terms of 3 gods. In chapter 2 of his commentary, Sri Aurobindo notes this, quote, "But the mind, the life, the speech, the senses are governed by cosmic powers, by gods, Indra, Vayu, Agni." Unquote. In chapter 6 of the commentary, he identifies 3 faculties of mentality, sensation, thought and will, and characterizes them thus, quote, "Mentality is composed of 3 principal elements, thought, will and sensation. Sensation may be described as an attempt of divided consciousness to seize upon its object and enjoy it. Thought as its attempt to seize upon the truth of the object and possess it. Will as its attempt to seize upon the potentiality of the object and use it. It is important to note that each of these faculties, including thought, for Sri Aurobindo, does not exist primarily for knowledge, but expresses a will to power that attains to its fulfillment in supermind of Brahman. They also relate to the three functions or three attributes of being or modes of existence in the human, according to the Upanishads: senses related to the body, thought related to the mind, and will related to the life force. These are the three modes that are governed by the gods, Indra, Vayu, and Agni. Indra governs mind, Vayu governs life, and Agni governs matter. In the parable, each of these gods fails in its encounter with the veiled power of Brahman, but mind pursues furthest, analogous to the transcendent idea in reason for Kant. Indra reaches the snowy summits, where he encounters Uma, daughter of the mountain, who points beyond to the Brahman. Sri Aurobindo, in his commentary on this part, makes Uma the integral source of cosmic becoming, who must be known by all the gods of faculties before they can become one with Brahman. Quote, Uma is the supreme nature from whom the whole cosmic action takes its birth. She is the pure summit and highest power of the One, who here shines out in many forms. Although Indra, Vayu, and Agni are the greatest of the gods, the first coming to know the existence of Brahman, the others approaching and feeling the touch of it, yet it is only by entering into contact with the Supreme Consciousness and reflecting its nature, and by the elimination of the vital, physical, and mental egoism, so that the whole function shall be to reflect the One and Supreme, that Brahman can be known by the gods in us and possessed. Unquote. The process of the transfiguration of the faculties that follows is an apprenticeship to science that makes the human nature an instrument of the divine consciousness and its operations. This is the process of building an intuitive nature that the Upanishads called Adhidaivika, of the gods. From this, the Upanishad turns to the process of the self, Adhyatmika, by which the reincarnating center of the individual rises through the mind to become the self of supermind, resulting in a complete and integral reconstitution of the human. In conclusion, I'd like to draw attention to chapter 8 of Sri Aurobindo's commentary, titled The Supreme Sense. Here he refers to 4 functions of the mind, which he attributes to the Upanishads. They are found in passing in the Aitareya Upanishad. Sri Aurobindo gives them concrete operational descriptions, of which this chapter is primarily concerned. The one which is the sense of the senses. This is the sense intuition samgyana. He gives a number of examples of this form of intuition, one of which coincides with an example of intuition as instinctive sympathy given by Bergson in chapter 2 of his book Creative Evolution. Sri Aurobindo's version is about the surgical precision of the wasp in directing its sting to immobilize its victim so as to make food for its young. If samgyana is a sympathy in sense, which brings us intuitive knowledge, pragyana is an intuition of spatial relations in cognition, and agyana an intuition of will in action. Vijnana is an integral intuition that includes a comprehensive knowledge of the whole and its parts, as well as the operational knowledge of the other three. Sri Aurobindo refers to these four types of intuition in some of his other major texts, such as The Life Divine and The Synthesis of Yoga, and they become properties of the mind that we can reflect on for developing an intuitive personality.